The Imperium was never silent, but this was different. It began as a low, dissonant hum at the edge of astropath Althea's perception, a psychic static that grated against the ordered choir of sanctioned minds. Seated within the adamantium-lined chamber deep beneath the Imperial Palace, Althea was one of dozens, their consciousnesses woven together in a lattice of thought and purpose, a beacon and a listening post for the galaxy-spanning Imperium. But today, the symphony of the warp was fraying. The familiar currents of the Emperor's light, the distant pulse of the astronomicon that was their guiding star, were being choked by a rising tide of wrongness. Visions, sharp and invasive, began to pierce the mental shields of the choir. Not the usual phantoms and echoes, but coherent, brutal images. Cities of gold and marble wreathed in emerald fire, their spires crumbling into ash. Souls, countless and screaming, their terror a psychic shriek that tore through the fabric of reality. Fire was not mere flame. It was sentient, hungry, a demonic presence that fed on anguish. Althea's breath hitched, her sightless eyes seeing far too much. The other astropaths in the choir shifted, their disciplined calm fracturing into a low thrum of shared dread. A warning. They had to send a warning. Her mind, trained and honed for this singular duty, reached for the psychic relay, the conduit that would carry her urgent message to the battle fleets and command citadels. She focused, pushing the horrific imagery into a coherent signal, a scream of alarm across the void. But the warp fought back. A wall of static, thick and cloying like boiling tar, slammed into her projection. It was not natural interference. It was a deliberate jamming, a smothering blanket woven from malice. Her signal dissolved before it could travel a single light year, swallowed by the cacophony. She tried again, straining until a sharp, coppery taste filled her mouth, the precursor to a psychic backlash. Nothing. They were cut off, isolated in a shrinking bubble of sanity as the Imperium itself turned against them. A tremor ran through her frail body, and her hand, pale and trembling, fumbled at her throat. Her fingers closed around the cool, familiar metal of her Rosarius. The sacred charms and inscribed prayers were a tangible anchor in a reality that was rapidly dissolving. But the comfort it usually offered felt hollow, a tiny pebble against an avalanche. The psychic echoes of the coming doom were no longer distant whispers. They were a tide washing over her, over all of Terra. In the profound isolation of her blindness, surrounded by the panicked psychic signatures of her peers, Althea felt a terror so absolute it was a physical weight on her chest. This was not a battle to be fought with ships and guns. This was the end of everything, and it was speaking to her in a language of fire and damned souls. The silence was the first sign that something was deeply, irrevocably wrong. It was not the quiet of a sleeping city or the hush of a holy day. It was a suffocating blanket, an absence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against the eardrums. Guardsman Kale stood his post on the battlements of the Imperial Palace, the worn ceramite of the parapet cool beneath his gauntleted hands. Below, the endless hive city of Terra should have been a roaring ocean of life, the rumble of ground crawlers, the distant hymns from 1,000 cathedrals, the ceaseless murmur of uncountable souls. Instead, there was only the wind, a listless, mournful sigh that carried the scent of ozone and cold stone. And the bells, distant, discordant bells tolling from sectors unseen, their notes not a call to prayer, but a slow, funereal knell that measured out the last moments of an age. Kale's gaze swept across the jagged skyline, a forest of adamantium and rockcrete that pierced a sky the color of bruised flesh. His mind, against his will, drifted across the light years to the agri world of his birth. He saw the endless, sun-drenched fields of golden corn, the scent of rich loam and growing things, the simple, sturdy house where his family would be sitting down to their evening meal. His wife's laugh, a sound he hadn't heard in 5 standard years, echoed faintly in his memory. His son, a boy he'd left as a toddler, would be nearly a man now. He had joined the Imperial Guard for the pension, for the promise of a plot of land upon his return, a dream of a quiet future. Now standing on the wall of the most fortified place in the known galaxy, that dream felt as fragile and distant as the faintest star. A soft crunch of boots on gravel announced a presence beside him. It was Sergeant Vorik, his face a roadmap of old scars and older worries, etched deep in the harsh light of the void shield generators. The sergeant did not speak, merely followed Kale's gaze out over the unnervingly still city. He offered a worn canteen. The water within was tepid and tasted of recycled minerals, but the gesture was one of simple, profound camaraderie. Further down the wall, the other members of the squad, young Lucas, who still believed every tale of Imperial glory and grizzled old Heron, who had seen too much of its grim reality, checked and rechecked their las rifles with a quiet, focused intensity. No jokes were exchanged, no boasts made. The usual pre-watch rituals had been abandoned, replaced by a shared, unspoken understanding that settled over them all like a shroud. They were veterans, every one of them, and they knew the feel of a battlefield before the first shot was fired. This was different. This was the silence of a tomb. Kale's hand tightened on the grip of his own weapon, the familiar weight a small comfort. He could feel it in the air, a static charge that raised the hairs on his arms beneath his flak armor. He could see it in the way the distant, flickering lumo signs of the city seemed to stutter and die, one by one, as if a great shadow was slowly being drawn across the world. It was in the unnatural quality of the twilight, which seemed to leach the color from everything, leaving the world painted in shades of gray and impending dread. The weight of his duty, once an abstract concept of oaths and loyalty, now felt as heavy and real as the palace walls themselves. He was a single, insignificant man, standing on the edge of eternity. The bells continued their grim tolling, each chime a hammer blow against the fragile quiet, counting down the seconds until the storm, gathering just beyond sight and sense, finally broke. Incense coiled through the cavernous silence of the Imperial Cathedral, thick as smoke from a dying star. It rose in lazy, gray-blue spirals towards the impossibly high, vaulted ceiling, where the faces of saints and martyrs, carved from obsidian and pearl, looked down with sightless eyes from the shadows. Sister Seraphina knelt alone before the great altar, her armor of polished ceramic and crimson cloth. A stark, defiant splash of color in the dim, golden light of 1,000 flickering offertory candles. Her head was bowed, her cropped white hair almost glowing in the luminescence, and her hands, encased in armored gauntlets, were clasped so tightly around the hilt of her power sword that the joints ached. The blade, planted point down into the marble floor before her, was both her anchor and her plea. The words of the litany of faith fell from her lips in a low, unwavering monotone, a river of devotion honed by decades of repetition. Each syllable was a brick in the fortress of her belief, each phrase a reinforcement against the doubts that clawed at the edges of her soul. She recited the canticles of steadfastness, the hymns of the unbreaking will, the passages that spoke of the Emperor's eternal vigilance. The familiar rhythm was a comfort, a psychic shield against the growing wrongness that permeated the very air. But then, a tremor ran through the foundation of her world, so subtle it was almost imperceptible, yet to her it was a seismic shock. The Emperor's light, the constant golden warmth that had always been the bedrock of her faith, the presence she felt in her soul as surely as her own heartbeat, flickered. It was not an extinguishing, not yet, but a faltering. A single, terrifying moment where the divine radiance that powered the Astronomicon and guarded the souls of humanity seemed to dim, as if a great and weary hand had briefly shielded its flame. The words of the litany caught in Seraphina's throat. Her unwavering chant stuttered into silence. A cold dread, colder than the marble beneath her knees, seeped through her armor and into her bones. For a heartbeat, she felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The statues of the saints seemed to leer, their benevolent smiles twisting into mocking grimaces in the dancing candlelight. The immense, golden effigy of the emperor upon the altar seemed less a god and more a corpse, enshrined in dying grandeur. Then, a sound from outside the cathedral's adamantium-reinforced walls pierced the holy silence, a low, rolling boom of distant thunder, but thunder that crackled with unnatural energies and carried on the wind echoes of screams. The storm was not of nature, but of the warp, and it was gathering. The sound acted as a galvanic shock to her system. Her moment of doubt shattered, burned away in a furnace of rekindled defiance. Her head snapped up, her eyes, sharp and fierce, fixing upon the Emperor's effigy. Her grip on the sword's hilt tightened anew, the psychically active crystal in its pommel humming in response to her will. Her personal prayer began then, not in the high Gothic of the ecclesiarchy, but in the simple, desperate tongue of the orphanage on Ophelia VII where she had been raised. It was a whispered, fervent stream of consciousness, a promise and a plea woven together. She swore her strength, her life, her very soul to the defense of this sacred ground. She begged not for salvation, but for the resolve to die well, to make her ending a testament to her faith. Her whispered words intertwined with the growing cacophony from outside, the rising wind that howled like a demon pack, the deep-throated roar of void shields under immense strain, the percussive crump of far-off detonations that were the first, tentative blows of the siege. The incense no longer smelled holy. It smelled like a pyre. The candle flames guttered in a sudden, foul breeze that slithered through the cathedral's grand arches. Sister Seraphina rose to her feet in one smooth, armored motion, her power sword flaring to life with a crackle of blue energy. Her final prayer was over. The time for supplication had passed. The time for war had begun. In the deep, silent heart of the Administratum, history was not lived but recorded, a slow, ceaseless river of data flowing from a million worlds into a sea of parchment and data slates. Scribe Orin's world was one of measured, quiet, broken only by the scratch of his autoquill and the soft, rhythmic hum of cogitator banks. His chamber was a canyon of knowledge, shelves stretching up into gloom, stacked with scrolls whose ends were lost to dust and time. For 47 years, his life had been the transcription of tithe reports, troop deployments, and agricultural yields, the mundane, vital pulse of the Imperium. He was a single, anonymous cell in the vast, unthinking organism of bureaucracy, and he had always taken a quiet pride in his small, perfect script, his unwavering accuracy. It was a defiance against the chaos of the galaxy, an order imposed one glyph at a time. The first anomaly arrived as a flicker on a data slate, a single line in a routine astropathic digest. A warp storm of unprecedented scale, reported near the Hydraffer system. Orin noted it, his quill pausing for only a second before moving on. Such things happened. The galaxy was vast and full of terror, but then another report scrolled. Across his screen, and another. Not just warp storms now, but frantic, fragmented accounts from the front lines of Segmentum Solar. Entire battle fleets, not on maneuvers but in full, panicked retreat. Regiments reporting contact with entities that broke the laws of physics. Vox traffic dissolving into screams and static. The data stream, once a placid flow, was becoming a torrent, a flash flood of panic and impossibility. Orin's hand slowed, his neat rows of script beginning to falter as he tried to categorize the uncategorizable. He looked up from his workstation, his old eyes scanning the cavernous hall. Thousands of other scribes bent over their tasks, a forest of bowed heads and moving hands. The air, usually thick with the smell of ink and ozone, now carried a new scent, the sharp, acrid tang of overheated machinery as the cogitators struggled to process the influx of catastrophe. Low, worried murmurs began to ripple through the ranks, a susurrus of fear that was far more terrifying than the silence it broke. Orin felt a profound, chilling futility settle in his bones. What was the point of this? What history were they preserving? They were documenting the death rattle of a species, carefully inscribing the symptoms of a terminal disease as the patient bled out on the table. Each report of a world going dark, each plea for reinforcements that would never come, was another line in a eulogy 10,000 years long. A low, deep tremor ran through the floor, subtle at first, a vibration that made the ink in his pot ripple. A fine dust sifted down from the shelves high above, powdering the parchment before him like gray snow. The murmur in the hall rose in pitch, edged with panic. The second tremor was stronger, a definitive shudder that rattled the data slates on his desk and sent a cascade of scrolls tumbling from a nearby shelf. The sound of their unrolling was like the sigh of a dying man. Alarms began to blare, their shrill electronic screams a stark contrast to the organic fear filling the chamber. Red emergency lumens flickered on, casting the canyon of knowledge in a hellish, pulsating glow, turning the careful script of centuries into a bloody scrawl. Orin's hand, which had frozen, now moved again. He did not run. He did not join the scribes who were now abandoning their posts, their cries echoing as they fled towards the sealed exits. Instead, he dipped his quill once more into the pot of black ink. His movements were slow, deliberate, a ritual performed in the heart of the maelstrom. He smoothed the parchment before him, ignoring the tremors that promised the ceiling would soon follow the scrolls to the floor. He began to write, not the official high Gothic of the reports, but in his own clear, simple hand. He documented the time, the nature of the anomalous reports, the first tremors. It was no longer a duty to the Imperium. It was an act of personal defiance, a final, quiet rebellion against the oblivion that was crashing down upon them. The ink was his only weapon, the record his only monument. As the world shook itself apart, Scribe Orin continued to write, a solitary guardian of memory in the burning library of history. The choir chamber's adamantium walls, once a bastion against the warp's cacophony, became a sounding box for the scream of a dying reality. The psychic hum that had plagued Astropa Althea swelled into a shriek, a pressure that threatened to crack her skull from the inside. Her sightless eyes, which normally perceived only the shifting tides of the immaterium, were seared with a new and terrible vision. High above Terra, in the space where the Emperor's light should have blazed brightest, the fabric of the sky was tearing apart. It was not a simple rift, but a suppurating wound in existence, a vortex of impossible colors that hurt the mind to witness. Through the gash, the immaterium vomited forth its filth. The serene, star-dusted black of the Terran sky was blotted out. Seething demonic tide, Althea's body went rigid in her restraint throne. Her hands, clutching the armrests, were bone white. The entities spilling from the wound were not mere phantoms. They were blasphemies given form, a legion of nightmares cast in shifting, iridescent flesh. Some were vast, leathery things that blotted out the light, their passage through the atmosphere leaving streaks of corrosive, psychic fire. Others were smaller, a skittering, shrieking horde that fell upon the spires of the palace like a rain of living, hateful meteors. The air itself grew thick and greasy, tasting of ozone, blood, and a sweetness so cloying it induced nausea. The psychic backlash was a physical wave, slamming into the choir. One by one, the astropaths around her convulsed, their mental fortresses crumbling as the demonic presence scraped against their souls. Some fell silent, their lifelights extinguished in an instant. Others began to babble, their disciplined minds unraveling into a tapestry of gibberish and screams. With a will forged in decades of service and terror, Althea fought through the psychic storm. Her fingers, trembling uncontrollably, found the activation rune on her vox unit. The red recording light glowed, a tiny, desperate star in the encroaching dark. She leaned into the grill, her voice a raw, broken thing, stripped of its usual cadence and control. She began her battlefield log, a final, stark testament hurled into the dying ether. She described the rupture, the size and scope of the wound in the sky. She named the entities she could comprehend, the winged horrors with eyes of molten brass, the things of slime and tentacle that defied geometry, the great faceless maws that consumed the light. Her words were clipped, frantic, a clinical report delivered from the edge of madness. She spoke of the psychic shrieks that were flaying the minds of every sensitive on the planet, of the Emperor's light guttering like a candle in a hurricane. Halfway through her transmission, the assault found her. It was not a physical blow, but a psychic one, a concentrated lance of pure, undiluted malice that punched through her final, frayed defenses. Her vox log dissolved into a choked gasp. The vision in her mind's eye did not go dark. It was overwritten. The demonic descent was replaced by an intimate, personalized hell. She saw her own flesh bubbling and sloughing from her bones, not in pain, but in ecstatic, demonic celebration. She felt the Rosarius at her throat grow hot, then cold, its sanctity a tiny, screaming protest against the infinite corruption flooding her being. The ordered pathways of her mind, the neural structures honed by a lifetime of imperial service, were being systematically torn apart and rewired into a shrine for this new, terrible truth. Her body arched backwards, a silent scream locked in her throat. The Vox unit crackled, picking up the wet, tearing sound of a psychic synapse detonating deep within her brain. The last sound transmitted was a whisper, a final, coherent thought forced through the ruin of her consciousness before it was swept away entirely. It was not a prayer, nor a curse, but a simple, devastating statement of fact. The sky is falling. Then there was only the static hiss of an open channel and the distant, triumphant roar of the warp as it claimed its first major victory on Terra, the fall of the Astropath's choir heralding the true and utter chaos to come. The first wave hit the walls not with the disciplined roar of an army, but with the shrieking cacophony of a madhouse unleashed. One moment, the unnerving silence held its breath. The next, the world dissolved into a storm of La's fire, screams, and the wet, tearing sounds of things that had no place in reality. Guardsman Kale's section of the wall became a charnel house in seconds. The Voxnet, once a channel for crisp orders, was now a torrent of overlapping panic, a symphony of the damned broadcast from 100 different hells. A voice shrieked a warning about cultists scaling the adamantium cliffs with unnatural speed, their eyes burning with heretical fire. Another screamed for holy promethium as a thing of brass and bleeding flesh shrugged off a full La's volley. The transmissions were a tapestry of the collapse, woven with threads of terror and static. Through the choking smoke and the lurid glare of muzzle flashes, Kale saw them. The cultists were a ragged tide of humanity gone feral, their bodies a canvas of profane sigils carved into their own flesh. They clambered over the bodies of their own fallen with insectal frenzy, their chants lost beneath the gunfire, but their intent a palpable wave of hatred. And among them, moving through the mortal ranks like sharks through baitfish, were the demons. One such horror materialized before Kale's position, its form a shifting, impossible contradiction. It was a pillar of glistening, segmented chitin that tapered into a nest of whip-like tentacles, each tipped with a screaming human mouth. It had no head, only a single baleful eye that burned with the color of a drowned sun, an eye that fixed upon Kale with ancient, intelligent malice. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The frantic shouts of his squad, the roar of the battle, all faded into a dull hum. There was only the demon and the cold, certain knowledge that his lasgun was a child's toy against it. The creature flowed forward, ignoring the lasbolts that sizzled harmlessly against its hide. A tentacle lashed out, too fast to follow, and young Lucas was simply gone, His final scream cut short as he was pulled into the thing's core and consumed with a wet, crunching sound. The horror turned its cyclopean gaze back to Kale, and in that moment he felt not just fear but a soul-deep awe. This was a piece of the universe's true, ugly face, a thing of the warp-given flesh, and its very existence was a blasphemy that threatened to unravel his sanity. Rage, cold and clean, burned through the awe and the terror. It was the rage of a man seeing his home defiled, his comrades butchered. He wasn't fighting for the Emperor or the Imperium in that moment. He was fighting for the memory of a sun-drenched Agri world, for the sound of his wife's laugh, for the life that had been stolen from him. He dropped his las rifle, his hands finding the familiar, heavy shape of a cracked grenade on his webbing. He primed it, the click deafening in his heightened awareness. The demon surged toward him, its multitude of mouths opening in a silent, triumphant shriek. Kale did not throw the grenade. He charged, meeting the horror's advance, and with a final, desperate lunge, he shoved the armed charge deep into the glistening, pulsating flesh where its heart should have been. The blast was a contained, concussive thump that threw him backward onto the blood-slicked stone. He landed hard, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. When it cleared, the demon was gone. In its place was a smoldering, greasy stain on the rockcrete and a scattering of twitching, dissolving flesh. He had killed it. The awe returned, now mixed with a profound, sickening horror. He had touched the unthinkable and destroyed it, and the act had left a stain on his soul that he knew would never wash clean. He looked at his hands, expecting to see them blackened with something more than soot. Vox in his helmet crackled, a weak, desperate plea from Sergeant Vorik calling for a fallback to a secondary position. The line was shattered. They were being overrun. Kale pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, his mind reeling. He saw the faces of the few remaining guardsmen in his squad, Harren, his grizzled features pale with shock, two others whose names he couldn't recall, their eyes wide with the same primal terror he had just conquered. They were looking to him. Vorik was down. Lucas was gone. He was what remained. He met their gazes, his own expression hardening into a mask of grim resolve. He pointed with his bayonet, its tip still clean, toward the rally point. His voice, when it came over the squad's private Vox channel, was rough, stripped raw, but it carried an iron certainty that cut through the chaos. It was not a shout, but a statement of fact, a promise made in the face of impossible odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and staring into the mouth of hell. But they were not yet broken. They would hold. For one more minute, one more hour, they would hold. The sound that heralded the arrival of the Adeptus Sororitas was not the roar of engines or the thunder of artillery, but a song. It rose from the throats of 50 battle sisters, a deep, resonant chant that cut through the cacophony of the besieged palace grounds like a blade through rotten flesh. It was the battle hymn of the unbreaking will, and at its head, her power sword casting a crackling blue nimbus in the smoke-choked air, was Sister Seraphina. Her armor, once immaculate crimson and polished ceramic, was now streaked with soot and the dark ichor of things not born of any sane world. Her face, beneath the helmet she had chosen to forgo, was a mask of serene fury, her eyes burning with a faith that was both beautiful and terrible to behold. They advanced in a phalanx of unwavering devotion, a moving fortress of prayer and promethium, stepping over the broken bodies of guardsmen and the dissolving remains of demons alike. Their faith was a tangible force, a psychic bulwark that caused the lesser warp spawn to recoil as if from a physical flame. A hulking, multi-limbed horror of brass and bleeding sinew lunged from a ruined archway, its maw distended in a silent scream. Before a single bolt round was fired, the air around the sisters seemed to thicken, to shimmer with golden light. The demon struck this invisible barrier and howled, its form sizzling and smoking as if plunged into consecrated ground. It was a miracle, a small, defiant spark of the divine in them. Overwhelming dark, and the sisters' hymn swelled in volume, their conviction feeding the phenomenon. Flamers coughed streams of holy fire, purging clusters of heretical cultists who shrieked and burned with the stench of cooked meat and blasphemy. Bolters spoke their percussive litanies, each shell a small, explosive prayer that punched through mutated flesh and demonic hide with equal, brutal efficiency. But for every miracle, there was an atrocity that tested the very foundations of their belief. Seraphina's gaze, sharp and unwavering, took in the full scope of the war's horror. She saw a guardsman, his mind broken, using his bayonet on his own comrade, babbling about the beautiful truths the darkness had shown him. She saw a sister from the Order of the Valorous Heart, a woman she had trained with on Ophelia VII, dragged down by a pack of flesh hounds. The sister's final act was to detonate her cracked grenades, the explosion a brief, sun-bright flower of death that consumed her in. Her attackers, there was no miracle there, only sacrifice. They passed through a courtyard where the civilian refugees had been gathered, now a charnel pit of dismembered bodies arranged in obscene geometric patterns. The air hummed with the residual power of a ritual, and the psychic stain of the mass sacrifice was a cold nausea in the pit of Seraphina's soul. Her resolve did not waver. It hardened, turning from fiery conviction to something colder, denser, and infinitely more durable. The gentle faith of the cathedral was gone, burned away in the crucible of total war. What remained was a core of absolute certainty, an understanding that the universe was a battlefield between light and an abyss so profound that mercy was a luxury they could no longer afford. This was not just a fight for territory. It was a crusade for the very concept of sanity. Her chanting never ceased, the words of the hymns now feeling less like a plea and more like a weapon, each syllable a hammer blow against. The encroaching void, the intersection of her devotion and the violence she wrought was no longer a paradox. It was a perfect, horrifying unity. To kill was to pray. To purge was to worship. In the Imperium's final hours, faith was not a comfort. It was a flamethrower, and she would scour the enemy from these holy grounds until either the Emperor's light returned or her own was extinguished in the effort. The first impact was not a sound, but a pressure, a sudden, violent compression of the air that slammed into Scribe Orin's chest and stole his breath. It was followed a microsecond later by the roar, a world-ending detonation that seemed to originate from the very core of the planet. The adamantium-reinforced ceiling of the Administratum Archive groaned, a sound of tortured metal that drowned out the screams of 10,000 scribes. Then the lights died, plunging the canyon of knowledge into an absolute, suffocating blackness, broken only by the hellish, strobing flashes of secondary explosions from somewhere far above. The second impact was closer. A section of the distant wall, a sheer cliff face of data stacks 100 meters high, simply vanished in a bloom of orange fire and shrapnel. The concussion wave hit Orin's station like a physical blow, sending his data slate skittering across the floor and his precious ink pot shattering, a black stain spreading like a bloodstain across the marble. Then came the fire. It fell from the ruptured ceiling not as flame, but as a rain of liquid promethium, clinging and hungry. It splashed across the towering shelves, and the knowledge of 10 millennia caught like tinder. Parchment scrolls, some older than the Imperium itself, ignited with a soft, heartbreaking whoosh, their delicate leaves curling into black ash in an instant. Data slates, their crystalline cores containing the histories of entire sectors, popped and cracked in the intense heat, their stored light dying forever. The air, once cool and dry, became a furnace blast, thick with the acrid smell of burning plastic, ozone, and the infinitely more tragic scent of burning paper. The smell of humanity's memory set ablaze. Orin moved without conscious thought, his body acting on an instinct deeper than fear. He ignored the panicked tide of his fellow scribes scrambling for blocked exits, their forms silhouetted against the advancing wall of fire. His world had shrunk to the single shelf before him, the one containing the Terran core logs, the foundational documents, the very first censuses and land deeds of old Earth. He grabbed an armful of the oldest scrolls, their casings of treated vellum already hot to the touch. He stumbled through the chaos, his thin frame buffeted by the heat waves, his lungs burning with every breath of superheated air. He reached a sealed blast door, its mechanism fused shut by the concussive force, and shoved the scrolls into a gap beneath it, a futile, desperate attempt to save a sliver of the past from the all-consuming present. A third impact, this one directly overhead, shattered his last hope. A colossal section of the ceiling, a 1,000-ton slab of rockcrete and steel, peeled away and crashed down into the heart of the archive. The shelf containing the core logs vanished, pulverized into dust and splinters. The blast door he had tried to use as a shield was twisted into a grotesque sculpture of molten metal. Orin was thrown backward, landing hard amidst a shower of burning parchment. He lay there, stunned, watching as the great library of the Administratum died around him. He saw a data stack the size of a hab block topple in slow, majestic silence, its fall scattering 1,000,000 burning pages into the air like a blizzard from hell. He saw the blackened, skeletal remains of scribes still hunched over their desks, their bodies fused to the melting plasteel. A profound and terrible resignation settled over him, a calm in the eye of the storm. The frantic energy of his desperate rescue. Attempt bled away, replaced by a hollow, aching grief. He was not just witnessing the death of a building or the death of people. He was witnessing the murder of history itself. Every scroll, every data slate was a voice from the past, a story, a law, a life recorded. It was the collective memory of the human race, the sum total of its triumphs, its follies, its very identity. And now it was burning. The fire was not merely consuming parchment and plasteel. It was consuming the proof that humanity had ever existed, that it had ever built, loved, or dreamed. The heat dried the tears on his cheeks before they could fall. There was nothing left to save. The great work of 50 centuries was turning to smoke, rising in a black pillar to join the demon-filled sky, the final, bitter exhalation of a species that had forgotten too much, too late. Scribe Orin closed his eyes, the image of the burning pages seared onto the back of his eyelids, the last guardian of a library that was now in forever ash. The command channels dissolved into a screaming tapestry of the apocalypse. The VoxNet, once a tool of order and imperial command, became a chorus of the damned, 1,000 overlapping transmissions bleeding together into a single, agonized hymn of extinction. In the command bunkers, tech priests and officers listened in horrified silence as the last, desperate voices of Terra painted a fragmented, chaotic portrait of a front line that was no longer a line, but a collapsing mosaic of isolated hells. From the sanctioned psycher's spires came a psychic scream, a raw blast of telepathic terror that overloaded vox-gasters and scrambled cogitators. It was not words, but pure, undiluted emotion, the sensation of 1,000,000 souls being simultaneously flayed, the psychic backlash of the Emperor's failing light. Buried within the scream were fractured images, a golden throne cracking, a great and terrible hunger waking in the dark, the taste of blood and ashes. It was a warning sent. Too late, a death rattle broadcast across every frequency. Amidst the psychic static, the voices of the Imperial Guard rose and fell like desperate gunshots. A young lieutenant, his voice cracking with strain, called for reinforcements at the Eternity Gate, his transmission punctuated by the roar of bolt guns and the wet, chittering sounds of things that were getting closer. A grizzled sergeant bellowed orders that were instantly swallowed by a colossal explosion, his vox link cutting to a dead hum. Another, a woman's voice, calm for a single terrifying moment, reported her position as being completely overrun before her broadcast dissolved into a gurgling scream, and the sound of ceramic being torn apart. They were voices from a dozen different sectors, 100 different regiments, all telling the same story in broken, frantic pieces. They spoke of ammunition running dry, of fields of fire collapsing, of demons walking through walls and cultists boiling up from the sewers. They were the last testament of the common soldier, their duty ending not in victory, but in a storm of static and blood. Weaving through the screams of soldiers and the shrieks of psychers was a third thread, a melody of absolute, unshakable faith. The battle hymns of the Adeptus Sororitas cut through the chaos, their Latin verses a stark, defiant counterpoint to the bedlam. A canoness's voice, iron-hard and resonant, recited the canticle of sacrifice as the sounds of her power armor being struck by claw and blade rang in the background. A different channel picked up a small squad singing the hymn of the Emperor's mercy as their flamers purged a corridor, the hiss of Prometheum a percussive beat to their chant. Then, one by one, the hymns were silenced. A final, shouted for the Emperor, was cut short by a wet, tearing impact. A chorus of voices was abruptly replaced by the deafening roar of a cracked grenade, and then, nothing. Their prayers did not end in pleas, but in declarations of loyalty that lasted until the very instant of their annihilation. The collage of sound was a symphony of the end, conducted by madness and scored in blood. It was the astropath's psychic death scream, the guardsman's last, unanswered call for help, the sister's final, fervent hymn. The transmissions overlapped, bled into one another, creating a horrific harmony where a prayer for salvation was drowned out by the roar of a demon engine, where a tactical report was interrupted by the sound of its author being devoured. The vox of the dying was not a record of a battle lost. It was the sound of a reality unraveling, a galaxy's worth of hope and order being crushed into a single, screaming point of light before being extinguished forever. Then, one by one, the voices fell silent until only the hiss of empty channels remained, a void where an empire had once spoken. The pain was a distant, irrelevant thing, a fading echo from a body that no longer felt like her own. Astropath Althea drifted in a sea of static and ruin, her consciousness untethered from the physical agony of the ravaged choir chamber. The psychic assault that had shattered her mind had left behind a strange, hollow clarity, a vantage point from which she perceived the death of a galaxy. The constant, golden pressure of the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that had guided humanity's ships for 10,000 years, had been her life's anchor, the steady rhythm to which her soul had beat. Now, that rhythm was failing. It was not a sudden snap, but a terrible, protracted guttering, like a candle flame drowning in its own wax. Her final vision unfolded not as a dream, but as a stark, undeniable truth imprinted upon her dying awareness. She saw the golden throne not as a symbol of power, but as a failing machine, its arcane mechanism seizing, its spirit gates groaning under a strain they were never meant to bear. The figure upon it, the master of mankind, was a silhouette of immense, agonizing stillness, but the light that poured from him was changing. The brilliant, life-giving gold was leaching away, bleeding into a dull, feverish orange, then a sickly, failing white. The great beacon that pierced the warp and held the darkness at bay was sputtering, its light growing thin and pale, its reach shrinking back from the galactic rim, from the spiral arms, from the segmentums, pulling back towards a dying Terra. It was the death of guidance, the end of the one constant that had bound the fractured Imperium together. Across 1,000,000 worlds, navigators would be screaming as their third eye was blinded. Starships would be cast adrift in the raging, starless sea of the warp, and entire sectors would be plunged into an isolation from which they would never emerge. A final, desperate impulse, the last coherent spark from the ruin of her will, flared within her. It was not a call for help, for there was no one left to hear. It was not a prayer, for the god was dying. It was an echo. A psychic ripple carrying a single, devastating data burst, a compressed image of the failing light, the splintering throne, the immense and terrible silence that was rushing in to fill the void. She cast this final thought outwards, a message in a bottle hurled into a tsunami. It would not save anyone. It would not even be understood by those few astropaths who might, for a fleeting moment, sense its passage. It was simply a testament, a final, defiant act of witness. A record that someone had been there at the very end to see the light go out. The echo fled across the stars, a ghost moving through a graveyard. It passed through systems where battles still raged, their outcomes now rendered meaningless. It skimmed the edges of worlds that would now live and die in ignorance, their celestial guidance severed forever. And as the ripple expanded, fading with distance, the source of its terrible message finally succumbed. In Althea's fading perception, the last flicker of the Emperor's light winked out, not with a bang, but with a sigh. The constant, reassuring pressure that had been the background hum of the universe for 100 centuries was simply gone, leaving behind an absolute, howling void. It was a silence more profound than any sound, a cold more absolute than the space between galaxies. The loss was not just strategic, it was spiritual, a fundamental amputation of hope from the soul of every human being who had ever looked to the sky for salvation. Astropath Althea's consciousness dissolved into that void, her final duty done, her last echo a fleeting scar on the face of an infinite, starless night. The Voxnet in Guardsman Kale's helmet was a graveyard of dead channels, filled only with the hiss of static and the faint, ghostly echoes of final transmissions from other sectors that had already fallen silent. His world had shrunk to a small, hellish pocket of reality at the base of the Eternity Gate. The grand, adamantium-reinforced portal, once a symbol of the Imperium's unbreachable might, was now a scarred and pitted monument to a lost war. The air was thick with the stench of ozone, promethium, and the coppery tang of blood, both human and otherwise. The ground was a treacherous morass of shattered rockcrete, spent shell casings, and the still-twitching remains of things that defied description. They had been pushed back, meter by brutal meter, from the outer walls to this, the final redoubt. There was nowhere left to run. His finger tightened on the trigger of his las rifle, the weapon hot enough to burn his gloved hand even through the fabric. He fired a sustained burst into a shambling mound of fused, screaming cultists that was clawing its way over a barricade of fallen comrades. The lasbolts punched through flesh and bone, and the thing collapsed, adding its own wretched mass to the gruesome fortification. A quick glance to his left confirmed what he already knew. Sergeant Vorik was gone, his body lost somewhere in the chaotic. Retreat. Old Heron lay a few feet away, his chest a ruin of splintered bone and scorched flak armor, his eyes staring sightlessly at the demon-filled sky. The faces of the other guardsmen who had stood with him on the wall were just memories now, ghosts in the smoke. He was the last of his squad, the last man standing at the gate. His other hand found the activation rune on his helmet's vox bead. The red light glowed, a tiny, defiant spark in the overwhelming dark. He did not call for aid. He did not report his position. There was no one left to hear, no command structure to respond. This was not a transmission for the Imperium. It was a transmission for the void, a final testament spoken into the teeth of the storm. His voice, when it came, was a raw, ragged thing, stripped of all military bearing, all pretense. It was the voice of a tired man at the end of everything. He began his log, his words punctuated by the crack of his lasgun and the shrieks of the enemy. He spoke of his squad not as casualty numbers, but as men. He recalled Vorik's stubborn loyalty, Heron's cynical grumbling that had hidden a heart of solid adamantium, young Lucas's bright-eyed faith that had been so brutally extinguished. He spoke of the agri world he would never see again, of the family whose faces were beginning to blur at the edges of his memory. He described the weight of his weapon, the taste of blood in his mouth, the chilling beauty of the warprift as it bled its nightmares into the world. He was not pleading, He was not raging. He was simply bearing witness, ensuring that someone, even if it was only the uncaring stars, would know that they had been here, that they had fought, and that they had died together. A larger shadow fell over him. He looked up from his firing position, his vox log trailing into silence. A greater demon, a hulking engine of brass and fury, was striding through the carnage, its passage causing the very ground to tremble. It ignored the pitiful. La's fire that spattered against its hide, its burning gaze fixed on the mighty eternity gate itself. This was the end. Kale felt no fear, only a profound, weary acceptance. He had known it would end like this. He rose to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He dropped his empty las rifle and drew his combat knife, the blade seeming like a toothpick against the cosmic horror before him. He did not charge the demon. Instead, he took a final step backward, his boot heels touching the cold, sacred metal of the Eternity Gate. He stood over Heron's body, a final, silent act of camaraderie. He looked at the faces of the fallen he could see, his friends, his brothers in arms. They had not broken. They had held. He would hold with them here at the end. He keyed his vox one last time, his voice a low, steady whisper that cut cleanly through the hellish din. It was a simple statement devoid of grandiosity, filled with the quiet dignity of a soldier who has done his duty. The gate holds. We hold. Then he released the transmit key, severing the link. The red light on his vox bead winked out. In the utter silence that followed within his helmet, Guardsman Kale tightened his grip on his knife, took a deep breath of the foul, burning air, and prepared to sell his life not for victory, but for the man standing beside him, even if that man was already dead. The sacred ground of the cathedral's outer courtyard was a charnel pit, a testament to the final, frenzied defense. The air, thick with the cloying sweetness of promethium and the metallic reek of split blood, was still. The cacophony of battle had moved inward, a distant, roaring tide of demonic shrieks and the last, desperate detonations of the Imperium's defenders. Here, amidst the shattered statuary and the scorched earth, only the dead remained. And Sister Seraphina. She knelt, her movements stiff and deliberate, each one sending a fresh wave of fire through her body. A deep gash in her side wept crimson through. Rent in her ceramite armor, the polished plates now a tapestry of scorch marks, ichor and the dents of countless blows. Her power sword lay beside her, its energy field dead, its blade notched and dulled. Around her, the bodies of her sisters lay where they had fallen, their own faith having purchased these few precious seconds of silence. Their faces, visible through broken helms or untouched, were serene in death, their final expressions frozen in prayer or defiant shouts. Seraphina reached out a gauntleted hand, its surface slick with gore, and gently closed the sightless eyes of the sister nearest her, a young woman named Lyra who had sung the battle hymns with a voice like polished silver. There was no time for burial, no time for the full rites of the requiem. There was only time for this. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, broken whisper, a ruin of the powerful chant that had led the faithful into fire. She began the litany of the fallen, the words for the last rites of a battle sister, her gaze moving from one still form to another. She anointed each brow with a thumb smeared with her own blood, a final, desperate blessing from a dying servant to the dead. As she finished the final benediction for the last of her squad, a new sound began to grow from the archway leading deeper into the palace's heart. It was not the roar of guns, but the wet, chittering, multi-throated murmur of the Neverborn, a tide of claw and fang and madness drawing ever closer. They had purged this courtyard, but the war was lost, and the victors were coming to claim their spoils. Seraphina's head rose, her eyes, fierce and unwavering, fixing upon the darkened arch. There was no fear in them. There was only a final, absolute clarity. To die here on her knees was to die well, but to die charging into the heart of the enemy to make her ending a weapon was to die as a martyr. It was the highest act of faith, the ultimate sacrifice that echoed the Emperor's own. She pushed herself. To her feet, her body screaming in protest, a fresh trickle of blood tracing a hot path down her leg. She did not reach for her power sword. It was a tool for killing, and her purpose now was transcendence. She took a single, stumbling step forward, then another, her gait steadying with each movement as her will superseded her failing flesh. And she began to recite the Martyr's Creed. It was an old, forbidden text, spoken only by those who sought a death that would become legend. Her voice, though ragged, grew stronger, finding a resonant power that belied her injuries. Let my blood be the ink that writes my devotion upon the earth. Let my death be the final prayer that sanctifies this ground. Let my soul be the kindling for the Emperor's wrath. She walked into the darkness of the archway, a single crimson and white figure advancing into an ocean of shadow. The demonic horde saw her, a final morsel of pure faith stumbling into their midst. They surged forward, a wave of glistening. Flesh, rusted metal, and piercing claws. Seraphina did not slow. She walked directly into them, her voice rising to a shout that cut through their gibbering. I am the vessel of his will. I am the unbroken word in the silence. I am the faith that does not yield. The first claws found her, tearing through armor and flesh. She did not flinch. She kept walking, kept chanting, her blood now watering the stones at her feet. A beast of tentacles and eyes wrapped around her, crushing, and still her voice rang out, now choked but defiant. My life for the golden throne, my death for mankind. The horde enveloped her completely, a seething, hateful mass of teeth and talons. But for a few seconds more, a single, clear voice could be heard rising from the center of the maelstrom, a beacon of pure, unadulterated faith in the heart of damnation. Then there was a final, triumphant shout, a name, the Emperor's, and then, abruptly, there was only silence. The last echo of the Martyr's Creed was swallowed by the dark, its speaker having offered everything, her voice finally, utterly, and completely silenced. The great collapse did not arrive with a roar, but with a groan, a deep, resonant protest of overstressed metal and fracturing rockcrete that vibrated up through the soles of Scribe Orin's worn boots. The ceiling of the secondary archive, where he had been thrown by the last cataclysmic impact, was buckling inwards, great spiderwebs of cracks racing across its vast, painted surface, depicting the unification of Terra in faded, flaking gold. Dust, thick and gray as ash, snowed down in continuous sheets, coating the few remaining stacks of data slates and the mountains of rubble that had once been shelves. The air was hot, thin, and tasted of powdered stone and ozone, the fires having burned themselves out, starved of oxygen in the sealed tomb the chamber had become. A single, flickering lumen strip sputtered on the far wall, its dying light casting long, dancing shadows that made the ruins seem to twitch and writhe. Orin pushed himself up, his old bones protesting, his robes heavy with grime. He was trapped. The main entrance was a solid wall of collapsed debris, and the emergency vents had been crushed shut. This was it, the final repository, not by design but by circumstance. He was the last scribe, the last witness in this particular ossuary of knowledge. His eyes, bleary and stinging, fell upon his desk. By some miracle, it remained upright, though one leg was shattered and it listed precariously. Upon it, amidst the dust and detritus, lay a single unblemished data slate, its screen dark and his auto-quill, its nib still sharp, resting beside a small, unspilled pot of ink. The sight was an anchor in the swirling chaos of his ending. The tools of his trade had outlasted the empire they served. He stumbled towards the desk, his movements slow, deliberate, a ritual performed at the edge of the abyss. He righted his chair and sat, the wood groaning. Under his weight, he dipped the quill. The scratch of its nib on the slate's surface was the loudest sound in the world, a tiny, defiant counterpoint to the groaning death of the planet. He did not transcribe a report. He did not catalog the fall. He inscribed a single stark sentence, the letters formed with the same precise, unhurried care he had used for 1,000,000 agricultural tithe reports. Each stroke was an act of remembrance, a final, stubborn assertion of order. Terra falls. The words glowed with a soft, amber light on the slate's surface. He stared at them, and a dry, soundless laugh escaped his lips. The irony was perfect, absolute. For 10,000 years, the Administratum had documented the relentless, grinding progress of the Imperium. Every battle, every decree, every grain of wheat counted and filed away. It had built a mountain of paperwork so vast it became its own reality. A bureaucracy that believed it could control the universe through the meticulous application of data. And now, at the culmination of all that effort, the final, definitive entry in the log of humanity was this. 2 words, an obituary for a species, written by a forgotten functionary in a collapsing room. All the triumphs, the horrors, the grand dreams, and petty squabbles of a galactic empire distilled into a simple, terminal statement. He did not write more. There was no need. Those 2 words contained everything. They were the end of the story. He set the quill down, the ink on its tip still glistening. Outside the trembling walls, he could hear the final, terrible sounds of the world's death, the shriek of falling architecture, the victorious howls of the neverborn, the immense psychic silence where the Emperor's light had been. But in his small, collapsing chamber, there was a profound quiet. The frantic energy of panic was gone. The grief for the burned archives had passed. There was only this final, solemn duty, perfectly completed. He leaned back in his chair, his work done. The bureaucracy was ending not with a bang, but with a notation. The great machine of imperial administration was shutting down, and he, Scribe Orin, had filed its death certificate. The ceiling above him groaned one last long sigh and began its final, slow descent. He did not look up. His gaze remained fixed on the glowing words on the slate, a tiny, flickering star of recorded truth in the absolute and imminent dark. The quiet was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a function fulfilled, of a system finally, completely, and irreversibly concluded. The great battle cries had faded, the screams of the dying had been silenced, and the roar of demonic triumph had receded, moving inward to feast upon the still-beating heart of the palace. In their wake, a strange and terrible serenity had fallen over the ruined city. The air, thick with the ghosts of smoke and ozone, was now still. A pale, sickly light filtered through the high atmospheric haze, casting the jagged ruins of the hives in tones of bone and ash. And through this sepulchral quiet, the bells tolled. They were the only sound of consequence, a slow, mournful, and ceaseless knell that seemed to emanate from the very bones of Terra. Their source was unseen, their purpose no longer called to prayer or alarm, but a simple, profound acknowledgement of an ending. Each resonant chime was a hammer blow against the silence, measuring out the long, final moments of a world in its death throes. From the shattered spires of the Imperial Cathedral, where Sister Seraphina had offered her final prayer, thin plumes of incense still rose. The great braziers had been overturned in the fighting, their holy contents scattered across blood-soaked marble, but the coals smoldered on, refusing to be extinguished. The gray-blue smoke curled up through broken stained glass windows, past the sightless eyes of decapitated saints, and into the poisoned sky. It was a final, ghostly offering, the last breath of a faith that had burned for millennia, now rising to meet a heaven that had been utterly vacated. The scent of sacred myrrh and low sticks intertwined with the stench of rot and promethium, creating a funerary perfume that hung over the ruins, a beautiful, heartbreaking paradox of sanctity and desecration. Scattered throughout the devastation, the last flickers of conscious life bore witness to this eerie calm. A lone guardsman, his mind shattered, sat on a pile of rubble that had once been a hab block, methodically polishing a broken lasgun with a bloody rag. his movements slow and precise, a tiny island of routine in an ocean of madness. In the shadow of a collapsed Aquila, a scribe from a minor Ordos, the only survivor of her unit, carefully etched the symbol of the Imperium onto a piece of plasteel with a shard of rock, her face a mask of tranquil concentration, her act as feudal and beautiful as a sandcastle built before the tide. A sanctioned psyker, blinded and driven mute by the psychic. Backblast simply stood in the center of a crater, his face turned upwards, feeling the last, fading echoes of the astronomican like the memory of a forgotten song, a single, serene tear cutting a clean path through the grime on his cheek. There was a devastating beauty in the totality of the destruction. The grand, sweeping arches of the spaceports now lay in elegant, skeletal ruins against the bruised sky. The once impervious battlements of the palace were sculptural forms of twisted adamantium and melted rockcrete, their collapse possessing a terrible, abstract artistry. Rivers of molten promethium had cooled into glossy black veins threading through the stone, reflecting the hellish light above. The bodies of the fallen, both human and demon, were arranged in tableaus of frozen violence, their final poses as dramatic and poignant as any classical sculpture. It was a canvas of ruin on a planetary scale, a masterpiece of annihilation where every shattered column and every still smoldering fire contributed to a horrifying, breathtaking whole. The bells continued their slow, funereal toll, their sound echoing through the canyons of ruin, a vibration felt in the dust and in the soul. The incense continued its lazy ascent, a final, fragrant soul leaving a corpse. The last witnesses continued their small, meaningless tasks, their humanity persisting even as its context was erased. This was the quiet after the storm, the moment between the last breath and the onset of rigor mortis. It was not peace, for peace implied a preceding conflict and a resolution. This was something else entirely, a serene and absolute acceptance of the end, a recognition that the story was over, and all that remained was the haunting, terrible beauty of the final page, written in fire and blood and silence. The last vestiges of astropath Althea's identity were dissolving, not into darkness, but into a seething ocean of pure, undiluted madness. The psychic backlash that had shattered. Her mind had not granted the mercy of oblivion. It had opened a door and the warp poured through, a gluttonous tide eager to consume the rare delicacy of a sanctioned soul. Her consciousness, once a finely tuned instrument of imperial will, was now a feast laid out upon a table of screaming reality, and the guests were infinite. They were not entities with names or forms, but raw concepts of hunger, echoes of ancient sins, and the distilled essence of every terror ever dreamed by mortal minds. They did not attack her, they simply were, and her being was the medium through which they expressed their nature. Her final, coherent thoughts were not her own, but a grotesque tapestry woven from the death throes of a planet. The burning of Terra was not a memory, but a sensation she wore like a skin. She felt the marble of the great cathedrals crack and blacken, the heat a blasphemous caress. She tasted the ashes of the administratum's archives, each mote of dust a forgotten name, a lost law. A story ended. The screams of the dying, from the lowliest serf to the highest lord, were not sounds but textures, a rough, grating weave against the silken background of the demonic chorus. The collapse was not an event she witnessed, but a process she underwent. The fall of the palace walls was the splintering of her own mental fortifications. The silencing of the emperor's light was the extinguishing of her own soul's spark. These mortal memories, rich with the flavors of despair and futility, were but the appetizer. The main course was her sanity itself. The ordered pathways of her brain, the neural structures that held her identity, her loyalty, her fear, were unspooled like thread and devoured. The memory of clutching her Rosarius was pulled apart, the sensation of cool metal perverted into the feeling of maggots burrowing under her skin, the prayers inscribed upon it rewritten as obscene litanies that promised an eternity of exquisite torment. Her lifelong service to the Imperium was inverted, becoming a profound cosmic joke at her expense, the punchline delivered by a million laughing mouths that bloomed like sores in the fabric of her mind. The warp feasted, and in its feasting it celebrated. Althea's consciousness became a festival of corruption, a carnival where the rides were built from broken oaths and the prizes were damnation. The triumph was absolute. This was the true goal, the victory that mattered more than any territorial conquest. The physical fall of Terra was merely the setting of the table. The real conquest was here, in the Imperium, where a soul trained in discipline and faith was systematically broken down and remade into a monument to chaos. Every scrap of her resolve, every echo of her prayers, every cherished memory of a quieter life was a spice that made the meal more satisfying. Her terror was the wine, her despair the main course, and the final, silent scream of her annihilated self was the sweetest dessert. There was no single moment of death, no final release. There was only a gradual, total assimilation. The entity that had been Astropath Althea was unmade, its components scattered and absorbed into the roaring, infinite chorus of the warp. The last flicker of her individual awareness was a final, psychic impression, not of pain, but of a vast, insatiable satisfaction, the feeling of a universe-sized hunger momentarily sated by the offering of a single, broken soul. Then there was nothing of her left to perceive. The feast was over. The plates were licked clean. The warp, having consumed its prize, turned its infinite, hungry attention elsewhere, its victory over sanity complete, its appetite for the souls of Terra only whetted. It was not a sound, but the end of one. A pressure that had existed for 10,000 years, a constant, golden hum at the foundation of reality, simply ceased. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was not an absence, but an active, chilling force, a psychic frost that extinguished the last embers of hope across the dying planet. The Emperor's light, the divine protection that had shepherded humanity through its darkest ages, was gone. Not diminished, not hidden, but utterly, irrevocably extinguished. The Divine Father had closed his eyes, and his children were left alone in the dark. On the blood-slicked stones before the Eternity Gate, Guardsman Kale felt the change not as a vision, but as a sudden, profound emptiness in his chest. The grim resolve that had sustained him through the loss of his squad, through the horror of demonic incursion, through the certainty of his own death, suddenly crumbled into dust. The feeling was one of absolute, terrifying abandonment. He was not just a soldier in a lost war. He was an orphan in a godless universe. The demon horde before him seemed to swell, its triumphant shrieks now echoing in a cosmos that no longer held any counterbalance to its malice. The cold metal of the gate at his back, once a symbol of ultimate sanctuary, now felt like the door to a tomb that had already been sealed from the outside. He had fought for a throne that was now empty, for a master who no longer listened. His sacrifice, and the sacrifice of every man and woman who had fallen beside him, had just been rendered meaningless. The silence was a verdict, and it declared that their duty, their courage, their very lives had been for nothing. Deep within the ravaged cathedral, in a side chapel where the air still stank of ozone and spilled blood, Sister Seraphina's final, whispered prayer died on her lips. The words, a plea for strength, for a sign, for any flicker of the divine presence that had been the bedrock of her existence, met only the new, absolute silence. The psychic connection that had fueled her miracles, that had hardened her resolve into adamantine certainty, was severed. It was not a gentle parting, but a brutal amputation of the soul. Her faith, a structure as real and solid to her as the cathedral walls, did not just waver, it shattered. The intricate stained glass windows depicting the Emperor's saints did not just look like corpses. They were corpses, their vibrant colors now the dull hues of decay and the failing light. The hymns she had spent a lifetime chanting were revealed as empty noise, the rituals as the desperate gesticulations of a species trying to conjure a parent who was not there. The divine protection she had believed was her shield was gone, and in its place was the chilling realization that she had been fighting for a ghost, and that her martyrdom would be a footnote in a story that had no author and no point. Across the ravaged psychic landscape of Terra, the last astropathic echoes faded into the growing void. The desperate warnings, the final pleas, the psychic screams of a billion dying souls, all were cut off, their transmission lines severed at the source. It was like watching the last few stars in a galaxy wink out, one by one, until only an infinite starless black remained. The network of sanctioned psychers, the choir that had once sung in harmony with the Astronomicon, was now a chorus of the mute. Their minds, once attuned to a glorious symphony, were now adrift in a silence so profound it was a physical agony, a pressure that crushed thought and memory into formless static. The Emperor's silence was not passive. It was a hungry thing, a maw that consumed the very concept of guidance, leaving behind a terrifying absolute freedom, the freedom of a ship without a rudder, cast adrift on an ocean of madness. The end of divine protection was not marked by a cataclysmic explosion or a final, dramatic battle. It was a quiet, internal collapse. It was the moment a soldier realized his oath was sworn to a corpse. It was the moment a priestess understood her prayers had been falling on deaf ears for centuries. It was the moment the galaxy's guiding light was snuffed out, leaving every human soul, from the lowliest serf to the highest lord, utterly and terrifyingly alone. The demonic legions pressing in on all sides were no longer the primary threat. They were merely the scavengers come to pick the bones of a corpse whose spirit had already fled. The true horror was the silence itself, a divine abandonment so complete that it rendered the physical destruction of Terra a mere formality, the sweeping up of ashes after the fire of faith had already gone out. The last Vox fragments crackled and died, their desperate signals swallowed by the all-consuming static of the warp. The frantic pleas of guardsmen, the final hymns of the sororitas, the clinical reports of officers, all dissolved into a single, uniform hiss, the white noise of extinction. The great chorus of humanity's defiance, which had swelled and raged for hours, fell silent. In its absence, a deeper sound emerged, the low, planetary groan of a world in its death throes, the sigh of continents settling into their final, ruined positions, and the crackle of an atmosphere poisoned by demonic essence. The planet burned, not with the clean fire of Prometheum, but with the sickly, phosphorescent glow of warp flame, a cold incineration that consumed stone, steel, and soul with equal indifference. From the void, had there been any left to watch, Terra would have been a terrible, beautiful pyre. The emerald and violet fires of the Imperium traced the coastlines of the ravaged continents, outlining the ghost of a world that was once the cradle of species. The great hives were reduced to blackened skeletons, their silhouettes stark against the inferno. The Imperial Palace, that mountain of ambition and power, was a crater of smoldering adamantium, its heart scoured out. The light of the conflagration did not illuminate. It revealed the absolute nature of the void it was soon to join. This was not a battle lost, but a story concluded, its final chapter written in fire across the face of humanity's home. The last echoes of human presence were not sounds, but resonances. They were the psychic afterimages of a species' final, collective breath. The memory of a soldier's oath, whispered into the teeth of a demon. The ghost of a prayer offered in a cathedral as the walls fell. The final, precise stroke of a scribe's quill, inscribing an end to all records. These echoes resonated across the stars not as signals, but as a change in the fundamental substance of reality, a permanent scar on the face of the cosmos. They were the lingering notes of a requiem, a final, wordless song of loss that would hum in the background of the galaxy forever, a haunting melody for a dead empire. A profound resignation settled over the ashes, a cosmic acceptance of the finality of the fall. The struggle was over. The hope was spent. All that remained was the awe-inspiring totality of the destruction. A vista of ruin so complete it approached a kind of terrible sublimity. The frantic energy of battle, the sharp sting of individual terror, the heat of faith, all had cooled into this vast, silent tableau. It was the quiet of a clock that has struck its last hour, of a heart that has beat its final beat. The awe was not for the victors, for the forces of chaos were merely the instruments of this conclusion. The awe was for the fall itself, for the sheer, unimaginable scale of an ending, for the silence that follows the last, fading note of a song 10,000 years in the singing. The requiem was over. The audience was gone. Only the empty theater remained, its stage dark, its echoes fading into the endless, starless night.